The lighthouse activated on a night when the ocean was perfectly still. No fog pressed against the coast. No storm approached from the horizon. The sea lay flat and dark, reflecting nothing, as if even the water expected the structure to remain silent. For nearly 30 years, the lighthouse had been dormant, its power cut, its mechanisms sealed, its purpose officially retired. And yet, just after midnight, the beam ignited and began its slow, deliberate rotation. It did not flicker. It did not struggle. It behaved as though it had never stopped. From the gravel overlook above the shoreline, Eleanor Hale watched the light sweep across the Atlantic in measured intervals. Each pass carved a pale arc through the darkness, steady and patient, like something performing a duty it had been holding in reserve. The sight sent a quiet pressure through her chest, not fear, not shock, but recognition she could not explain. She had not come here expecting anything to happen. The drive north along the Massachusetts coast had been automatic, guided more by muscle memory than intention. This stretch of shoreline had always been where unfinished thoughts drifted when Eleanor could not sleep. She told herself she was here to think, to breathe, to escape the weight that had followed her for weeks. She did not tell herself she was here because her brother was gone. Nathaniel Hale had disappeared 21 days earlier. An adult man. A coastal engineer with licenses, credentials, and habits built on precision. He had been contracted to assess the structural integrity of the old lighthouse before its conversion into a historical site. According to records, he had checked in at the harbor office early that morning, collected the necessary keys, and driven out along the service road that wound toward the bluff. His truck had been found exactly where he left it. His tools remained organized inside. The lighthouse itself showed no sign of damage, struggle, or urgency. Nathaniel, however, had not been recovered. The official explanations arrived quickly, packaged in calm voices and rehearsed language. A fall from the upper platform. A misjudged step. The sea claiming what it always claimed. Eleanor listened without interruption, nodding at the appropriate moments, absorbing each possibility without accepting any of them. Her brother did not make careless mistakes. And he did not leave things unfinished. Now, as the beam passed over her windshield and briefly illuminated her reflection, Eleanor felt the unmistakable sensation of being acknowledged. The light did not linger long, but the moment it touched her, something tightened, as if a question had been asked without words. The lighthouse completed another rotation. Still no sound. Still no reason. Eleanor remained in her car until the engine cooled and the night air pressed closer, until the light had passed her position 3 more times with identical precision. When she finally turned away and drove home, she did not feel relief. She felt delayed. The following morning, Eleanor found a folded paper tucked neatly into her mailbox. At first glance, it looked ordinary, creased once down the center, no envelope, no postage. She assumed it was a misdelivered notice or an old flyer caught by the wind. She did not recognize it as important until she noticed the handwriting. Nathaniel's handwriting. The paper was a tide chart, carefully marked in pencil. Dates, times, notations along the margins. But the entries did not correspond to current conditions. They described tides from years earlier, specific days Eleanor remembered vividly for reasons that had nothing to do with the sea. One date was circled heavily. Beneath it, a single note had been added. Still holding. Eleanor stood at the mailbox long after she had finished reading, the paper trembling slightly in her hand. Her brother's handwriting had always been meticulous, controlled, unmistakable. This was not a copy. Not a coincidence. And it had been placed there deliberately. That night, the lighthouse turned on again. Only this time, the beam slowed as it crossed the shoreline, just enough for Eleanor to be certain that whatever was guiding the light knew exactly where she was standing. Eleanor did not decide to go to Salem. The decision assembled itself gradually, without urgency, shaped by the steady accumulation of things that refused to explain themselves. The lighthouse light turning on without power. The tide chart written in her brother's hand. The note that suggested endurance rather than disappearance. Each detail pressed inward, narrowing her options until logic no longer felt like a path forward. By the time she crossed into the older part of the city, resistance had already lost its function. Salem did not greet her. It compressed around her. The streets narrowed subtly as she drove farther from the familiar routes, away from storefronts and practiced history, into areas that felt less rehearsed. The air carried weight without cold. Buildings leaned closer together, as if architecture itself had learned the value of proximity. Eleanor parked where the road thinned into something barely intentional and walked the rest of the way. She noticed the house only because it refused to draw attention. 2 stories. Dark wood, nearly black from age and rain. Tall, narrow windows that reflected nothing clearly. No lights announcing welcome. No symbols inviting curiosity. Beside the door hung a small, hand-painted sign, its lettering uneven but deliberate. Rowan Graves. Private readings. Nothing else. Inside, the air was still, dry, carrying the faint scent of old paper and wood. The room was modest in size, painted a deep gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. A single desk lamp illuminated a scarred wooden table covered with a dark cloth. No music played. No clock ticked. The silence did not feel empty. It felt occupied. Rowan Graves sat already waiting. He did not stand when Eleanor entered. He did not greet her or gesture toward a chair. He remained seated, hands resting near a worn deck of tarot cards wrapped in dark fabric, as if the moment had been accounted for long before she arrived. His presence altered the room without movement, the way pressure changes before weather turns. Eleanor sat because the space allowed it. She spoke without knowing why she chose to begin where she did. She described the lighthouse first. Its activation. The impossibility of it. She spoke of her brother next, not with emotion, but with precision. His work. His habits. The careful way he approached responsibility. She described the tide chart last, unfolding the paper and placing it on the table between them. Rowan Graves did not touch it. When Eleanor finished, the silence returned, heavier than before. Then Rowan reached for the deck. The movement was slow, economical, without ceremony. He did not ask a question aloud. He did not invite Eleanor to cut the cards. He laid 5 of them out across the cloth in measured alignment. The first card represented the current state. Rowan indicated that it did not show loss. It showed activity mistaken for absence. According to the card, something believed to be empty was still performing its intended function, uninterrupted by official conclusion. The second card marked the severed connection. This card did not depict conflict or betrayal. It showed interruption. A bond paused rather than ended, leaving responsibility suspended instead of transferred. Rowan noted that when no one acknowledges a shift, systems compensate on their own. The third card revealed the moment of distortion. This card carried weight. It pointed to a choice delayed rather than refused. A decision postponed under the assumption that time itself would resolve the imbalance. Rowan stated that delay was not neutral. It was interpretive. The fourth card was the symbol. Rowan's hand hovered briefly above it before settling. He explained that the lighthouse was not acting as a beacon. It was acting as a structure built to guide others, now redirected inward. According to the spread, it was responding not to weather or navigation, but to an unresolved obligation embedded within its reach. The final card lay at the edge of the spread. The condition. Rowan Graves stated, without emphasis, that the light would continue. Not to warn. Not to harm. To persist. Until what had been deferred was acknowledged openly. Not corrected. Not forgiven. Acknowledged. He did not explain what acknowledgement required. He did not explain what would happen if it did not occur. Rowan gathered the cards slowly, returning them to the cloth as if sealing something rather than concluding it. The room felt heavier afterward, not because something had been added, but because nothing had been removed. Eleanor left the house carrying no instructions. Only the certainty that the lighthouse was no longer malfunctioning. That night, as darkness settled over the coast, the beam turned on once more. And the tide chart in Eleanor's mailbox changed again. The new chart appeared before sunrise. Eleanor found it folded along the edge of her mailbox, positioned with the same deliberate care as before, as though whoever placed it there expected her to recognize the pattern by now. The paper was identical in weight and texture to the first. The handwriting was unchanged. Precise. Controlled. Familiar enough to unsettle her before she read a single marking. This chart did not track tides. It tracked dates. Eleanor recognized them immediately, moments lifted from her own memory, stripped of context and reduced to notations only Nathaniel would have thought to record. A weekend she had postponed a visit. A phone call she had ended early. An agreement she had treated as temporary because it was inconvenient to resolve fully. Each date was accompanied by a small mark in the margin. Not a warning. Not an accusation. A hold. One entry was circled more heavily than the others. 5 years earlier. The day Eleanor accepted a position inland, convincing herself it was practical. Responsible. Temporary. Nathaniel had stood beside her at the kitchen counter that morning, listening without interruption as she explained her reasoning. He had nodded once and said he would manage things along the coast. The property. The committees. The maintenance obligations no one else wanted to claim. She had thanked him. She had not asked what managing would require. Standing on the shoreline that evening, Eleanor folded the chart carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. The ocean stretched out before her, dark and controlled, its surface betraying none of the inconsistencies she had begun to notice elsewhere. The lighthouse beam swept across the water with disciplined regularity. But the shoreline no longer behaved the way Eleanor remembered. Rocks lay where they should not have been, their arrangements subtly altered, as if the land itself had been adjusted by increments too small to argue with. The waterline reached farther inland than predicted, then withdrew abruptly, leaving dampness where there should have been dry ground. Eleanor checked local tide schedules out of habit. They did not match what she was seeing. The lighthouse beam paused when it reached her position. Not long enough to feel intentional. Not short enough to be dismissed. The light lingered for a fraction of a second before continuing its rotation, as though confirming her location before moving on. The following night, it lingered longer. Eleanor began returning to the coast at the same hour each evening, driven by a need she did not attempt to justify. Each time, the beam adjusted its rhythm slightly, tightening its sweep, narrowing its focus. It no longer cast wide arcs across the horizon. It traced shorter paths, concentrating on the stretch of shoreline directly in front of her. As though the structure were correcting its aim. Boaters began reporting minor interference. Compass readings that drifted. Instruments that recalibrated without instruction. Nothing dangerous. Nothing that warranted alarm. Just enough to unsettle those who relied on consistency. The authorities dismissed the reports. Eleanor did not. She began to understand that the lighthouse was not failing. It was refining. Late one evening, as the beam completed another shortened pass, Eleanor felt something settle into place, not clarity, but alignment. The realization arrived without drama, heavy and undeniable. The light was no longer guiding anything outward. It was addressing something that had been left behind. Nathaniel had not vanished suddenly. He had not been claimed by the sea in a moment of error. He had stayed longer than required. Returned more often than documented. Taken on responsibilities that did not belong to him alone. He had been holding something in suspension. And now, whatever he had been containing was no longer willing to wait. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of gulls circling lower than usual, their calls sharp and restless. When she stepped outside, she noticed dampness along the road where no rain had fallen. The air smelled faintly of salt, even miles inland. Her phone showed no missed calls. But her mailbox held another chart. This one was nearly empty. Only one date remained. Today. And beneath it, written with the same steady hand, a single note. Running out. Eleanor returned to the lighthouse in daylight. It felt important that she see it without shadows, without the authority the night seemed to grant it. The structure rose from the bluff with the same restraint it always had, whitewashed stone weathered by decades of salt and wind, its surface marked by age but not neglect. From a distance, nothing about it suggested urgency or danger. Up close, it felt occupied. The access door opened without resistance. No broken locks. No forced entry. Inside, the air was cooler than expected, carrying the faint metallic scent of machinery that should have been inert. Eleanor paused just inside the threshold, aware of the subtle pressure she had felt every night along the shoreline now pressing inward, as if the lighthouse were measuring her presence. The stairs spiraled upward in familiar increments. Each step bore the faint impression of repeated use, too recent to be dismissed as historical wear. Nathaniel had been here longer than the official records admitted. Not rushing. Not trespassing. Maintaining. At the upper level, beneath the sealed control panel, Eleanor found the journal. It had not been hidden. It rested in plain view, placed with intention, as if Nathaniel had assumed the right person would eventually stand where she was standing now. The cover was worn, the pages creased from use. Eleanor did not open it immediately. She already sensed what it contained. The entries were practical. Observational. Nathaniel wrote about fluctuations in the light's response long before it reactivated fully. About nights when the mechanism hummed faintly despite the absence of power. About the way the structure reacted not to storms, but to periods of neglect, intervals when responsibility shifted without acknowledgement. One passage appeared repeatedly, rephrased but consistent in meaning. The lighthouse responded to imbalance. It did not guide ships. It compensated for absence. Nathaniel had begun to understand that the structure was holding something in suspension, not a signal, not energy, but obligation. When roles were abandoned quietly, when responsibility was deferred under the assumption that someone else would absorb it, the lighthouse retained the pressure rather than releasing it. It held. The final entry was dated 3 days before his disappearance. Nathaniel wrote that the light had begun to narrow its focus. That it no longer responded to his presence alone. That it was waiting for acknowledgement rather than maintenance. He noted, without accusation or regret, that Eleanor had not returned to the coast in 5 years. He did not write her name after that. Eleanor closed the journal slowly, the weight of it settling into her arms. The truth did not arrive as guilt. It arrived as structure. Nathaniel had not stayed because he wanted to. He had stayed because someone had to. And because Eleanor had left without closing the exchange, the lighthouse had adapted. It had accepted Nathaniel as containment, not caretaker. When he reached the limit of what one person could hold alone, the structure had activated, not to replace him, but to summon recognition. That night, the beam turned on earlier than usual. Its rotation was slower now. Heavier. The light no longer swept the horizon at all. It traced only the shoreline directly below the tower, repeating the motion with deliberate insistence. Eleanor stood at the base of the lighthouse as the beam passed overhead, aware that it was no longer searching. It had found what it was addressing. And it was no longer willing to hold the weight alone. Eleanor stopped sleeping in complete intervals. Rest came in fragments now, brief descents into unconsciousness that ended abruptly, as if something external were measuring how long she was allowed to disengage. Each time she woke, the same sensation returned first, pressure. Not on her body, but on her awareness, like a question waiting for a response she was deliberately avoiding. The lighthouse beam no longer felt distant. From inland, she could sense its rhythm even when it was out of sight. Not as light, but as insistence. A steady pulse that marked time differently than clocks did. When night fell, Eleanor found herself tracking its rotation without meaning to, counting the seconds between passes as if the pattern itself were asking her to notice how precise it had become. The beam had narrowed again. It no longer touched the open water at all. Its sweep was confined to a short stretch of coastline, tracing the same arc repeatedly, polishing the darkness there until the night itself seemed thinner along that line. Fishermen along the shore began avoiding the area without quite knowing why. Boats altered course instinctively. Equipment malfunctioned just often enough to encourage distance. Nothing catastrophic occurred. The lighthouse did not need catastrophe. It needed compliance. Reports accumulated quietly. Compass drift. Radio interference. Inconsistent depth readings near the bluff. Each complaint was logged, investigated, dismissed. The structure remained officially dormant, its reactivation unexplained and therefore unresolved. Systems designed to escalate problems stalled because no category existed for what was happening. Eleanor recognized the pattern immediately. It was the same pattern she had relied on for years. Delay without refusal. Deferral without closure. She began to understand that the lighthouse had not awakened suddenly. It had been active for a long time, restrained only by Nathaniel's presence. He had absorbed the imbalance by staying, by returning, by accepting responsibility that had never been formally assigned to him alone. He had become a buffer. And buffers eventually fail. The realization followed Eleanor everywhere now. In the quiet of her kitchen. In the silence of her car. In the way the ocean smell seemed to reach farther inland each night, faint but unmistakable. The structure was no longer content to contain what had been deferred. It was redistributing it. Eleanor returned to the shoreline just before midnight on the 6th night after finding the journal. The beam passed over her almost immediately, its light sharper than before, cutting through the dark with reduced patience. When it moved on, she felt something shift, not relief, not fear, but escalation. The lighthouse was no longer waiting. It was progressing. She thought of Nathaniel standing inside the tower, night after night, responding to something no one else acknowledged. He had not been trapped. He had been engaged. Holding the pressure steady while hoping someone would eventually recognize that it was shared. Eleanor had mistaken his silence for capability. She had mistaken endurance for resolution. The next morning, the mailbox was empty. No chart. No note. No handwriting to translate what was happening into symbols she could manage. The absence felt deliberate, not accidental. As though the lighthouse had decided Eleanor no longer required reminders. She was aware now. And awareness, she understood, carried its own obligation. That evening, Eleanor did not drive to the coast. She stayed inside, testing whether distance still mattered. As darkness settled, she waited for the familiar tightening in her chest, the subtle internal alignment she had come to associate with the light's rotation. It arrived anyway. Stronger. Closer. The lighthouse no longer needed her physical presence to mark her position. It had adjusted its understanding. The structure did not operate on proximity alone. It responded to acknowledgement, and Eleanor had finally begun to see the shape of what she owed. Holding responsibility without recognition did not make it disappear. It made it accumulate. And the lighthouse, built to endure storms and absences alike, had reached the limit of what it would hold on someone else's behalf. Eleanor returned to Salem without checking the time. The decision did not feel urgent. It felt inevitable, like a conclusion that had been forming long before she understood the premise. The city received her the same way it had before, without ceremony, without resistance. The narrow streets appeared unchanged, but Eleanor sensed the difference immediately. What had once felt like pressure now felt like alignment. The house stood where it always had. Dark wood. Narrow windows. The sign unchanged. Inside, Rowan Graves was already seated. This time, Eleanor did not speak first. She no longer needed to arrange her experience into language. The lighthouse had done that for her. She understood now why Rowan had not offered instruction during her first visit. Instruction implied choice. What remained now was not choice, but position. Rowan laid out the cards without prompting. The first card revealed the present state. It showed strain without rupture, a system stretched to capacity but not yet collapsed. According to the spread, containment was still active, but no longer stable. The second card marked the severed connection. It no longer depicted interruption. It showed imbalance corrected temporarily by substitution. Rowan indicated that Nathaniel had not replaced Eleanor's role permanently. He had absorbed it provisionally. The third card showed the moment of distortion again, but clearer now. The delay had hardened into structure. What had once been postponed as practical had become interpreted as permanent absence. The fourth card was heavier than before. It showed transfer. Not rescue. Not exchange. Recognition. Rowan stated that the lighthouse did not require sacrifice. It required symmetry. What had been held by one person in isolation had to be acknowledged by the one who had deferred it. The final card was the condition. Rowan Graves spoke only once. He stated that Eleanor could not undo what had already occurred. Nathaniel's time within the structure could not be erased. Containment left residue. But the lighthouse no longer needed to hold him if responsibility was claimed openly and without justification. Not privately. Not emotionally. Openly. Rowan did not explain what form that acknowledgement should take. He did not warn her what would happen if she failed. His silence carried more weight than instruction ever could. Eleanor understood. The lighthouse did not respond to regret. It responded to recognition. She left Salem as she had arrived, without comfort, without reassurance, but with something far more exact. The structure had narrowed its demand to a single point. The beam no longer pulsed at the edge of her awareness. It waited. That night, the lighthouse slowed. For the first time since its reactivation, the beam hesitated between rotations, lingering in darkness longer than before. The ocean beneath it remained calm, the shoreline unchanged, as if the world itself were holding still to observe what Eleanor would do next. She stood at the base of the bluff, looking up at the tower without fear. The lighthouse had not summoned her to intervene. It had summoned her to acknowledge what had always been hers to carry. And now that she understood that truth, there was no longer anywhere else to go. Eleanor did not climb the lighthouse. That was the first choice she made that felt entirely correct. She remained at the base of the bluff as night settled, standing where land met structure, where the obligation she had avoided for years had always been anchored. The ocean lay quiet below, its surface dark and unreadable, as if it, too, were waiting for something to be completed rather than changed. Above her, the lighthouse stood silent. Not dark in the way abandoned things are dark, but paused. The beam did not turn immediately. It waited through a longer interval than Eleanor had ever known, holding the absence with deliberate restraint. For the first time since the light had returned, the structure did nothing without her acknowledgement already in place. Eleanor spoke aloud, though no one else stood within reach. She acknowledged the exchange as it had truly occurred, that she had left the coast believing responsibility could be absorbed without cost, that she had allowed her brother to become containment rather than counterpart, that she had mistaken endurance for consent. She named what had been deferred, not as failure, but as fact. The air changed. Not dramatically. Not violently. The pressure Eleanor had carried for weeks eased, not disappearing, but redistributing, as if the weight had finally been lifted from a single point and allowed to settle where it belonged. The lighthouse remained still for several seconds longer. Then the light activated one final time. The beam turned slowly, completing a full rotation that did not search the horizon or trace the shoreline. It cast its arc outward once, wide and complete, as if restoring a pattern that had been interrupted rather than broken. When it passed over Eleanor, it did not linger. It did not need to. The light dimmed after that, gradually, deliberately, until the tower returned to darkness. No flicker. No malfunction. The mechanism powered down with the quiet certainty of something that had finished the work it was never meant to do alone. The following morning, the coast was calm. No interference was reported. Instruments corrected themselves without explanation. The lighthouse remained dormant, its presence once again reduced to architecture rather than insistence. Officials later described the reactivation as a fault that resolved itself. Eleanor did not argue. 3 days later, Nathaniel was found walking along the shoreline several miles north of the bluff. Disoriented. Exhausted. Alive. He could not explain where he had been, only that time had behaved strangely, compressed in some moments, absent in others. He remembered the light dimming. He remembered the sense of release. He did not remember holding anything alone. Recovery was slow. Incomplete. Nathaniel returned to ordinary life with subtle absences that no one else noticed, spaces in his awareness that never quite filled back in. Eleanor did not ask him to explain them. Some responsibilities, once acknowledged, do not return to abstraction. They settle into place, reshaping the life built around them. Eleanor took on the work Nathaniel had been containing, not out of guilt, not as penance, but because recognition had made avoidance impossible. The lighthouse stayed dark. It did not need to remember anymore. And on nights when the ocean lay still and the horizon refused to offer answers, Eleanor no longer felt watched or summoned. The weight that had once demanded a signal now rested where it belonged, shared, visible, no longer deferred. The light, properly released, never turned on again.